Hey class, and welcome back to another lecture for Psych 241. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 7, Attitudes and Attitude Change. And attitudes are a very interesting topic, and hopefully this will give a lot of insight, and I hope have some good discussions. Today we're going to talk a lot about a lot of different things, but one of the most important things I think we'll talk about is this idea of cognitive dissonance. And I really think that if you want to know what are things that I think you should be picking up from this class, one of them is cognitive dissonance, because if you start to notice it, you can really notice how people maybe aren't being truthful to the truth and maybe looking at how to comfort themselves. But we'll get to that. Firstly, in terms of announcements, stop by office hours if you have any questions, 11:30 to 12:30 from Tuesdays and Thursdays. Remember your SONA credits that you need to get done, and don't forget about those paper deadlines. They will be kind of coming up now a little bit faster throughout the semester. But without further ado, let's talk about where we're going. Well, today we're going to first talk about the basics of attitudes, what they are, where they come from, how we measure them. Then we'll talk about attitudes and behavior. When do attitudes predict behavior and when don't they? We'll talk about when we change attitudes and how do they change. Then we'll talk a lot about cognitive dissonance. We'll finally end with this idea of self-perception theory in some broader sense of rationalization for how we kind of think. But let's start off with the basics, the basics of what's an attitude. Well, an attitude is at its core the evaluation of an object. And by object, I mean anything. An idea can be an object in this case. A person, a thing, a belief, all of these can be evaluated. And what do we mean by evaluation? Well, we can think of valence, right? Whether it's positive or negative or neutral. We can think about strength. We can think about a lot of different things, right? But in general, it's an association in our memory between something, an object that we call this, right? But it doesn't have to be a physical object, and our evaluations. And often we have an affective reaction to that object, so some kind of emotional reaction to that. So how much we like or dislike things. And so an attitude can be described as an evaluation of people, objects, or ideas. Again, we can talk about this idea of the valence. Is it positive? Is it negative? What's the strength of it? Is it a strong, do you have a strong belief about this, or do you not have a strong belief? If somebody came up to you and said, what do you think about purple grapes instead of green grapes? There are people who really care and have a strong, a strong attitude towards pro-purple or anti-purple grapes. I just will eat any grapes you give me. But that's, so how do we understand this attitude? Well, we can use what we call the ABCs of attitudes. Easy enough. Affect, we've already talked about. How does this make you feel? What's the valence? Positive, negative, neutral. Behavior, how do you act towards your target? And this is interesting because there are some attitudes that we just won't, have a behavior on, I can, again, I'm trying to think of a good example here. So my football team from home that we always used to follow was the Browns. And the key to that is the Browns are the worst football team in the league most years. So my behavior towards them was always I was never going to go to a football game, even though tickets were pretty cheap. But I rooted for them. I didn't watch them, but that's a behavior I might have towards them. And then a cognition, your knowledge or beliefs about the target. Now, what's interesting about this, though, is that Texas A&M, they have this huge rivalry with Texas University, or the University of Texas at Austin. They call it TU instead of UT. I don't get it. But the idea is that, for these guys, they tend to have this very strong negative feeling about these, or this. They tend to really not like people from Texas University. And then they often believe that people from TU are not exactly as smart, or maybe not as good as A&M students. And when we think about what kinds of attitudes are mainly affective, behavioral, or cognitive, they oftentimes are very linked together. However, we can think of examples, and I'm not going to spend too much time here talking about which ones are kind of mainly focused on affect, mainly focused on behavior, mainly focused on cognition. But right, they're often consistent, but sometimes not. For instance, if you don't like spiders like most people, that's one thing. But this little guy often has a much more positive affect of a spider compared to our other guy that we had on that last one. So recognizing that they're not always perfectly consistent. So where do they come from? Well, part of this is genetic factors. Identical twins tend to share more attitudes than fraternal twins, but this isn't a one-to-one relationship, right? Twins are different, believe it or not. We can talk about direct experience. I just got done teaching a lecture on classical conditioning and remembering things like if you ever had this terrible tasting children's Tylenol when you were young, you might have a strong negative attitude towards medicine of this sort. For instance, I don't like grape medicine anymore because it's gross and I had to have a lot of it as a kid when I wasn't feeling good. And we can also talk about this idea of social learning, right? A&M was full of this, right? This idea of parents and peers being the ones who teach us what we can and can't do. Things like operant conditioning, knowing that we'll get rewarded or punished for certain behaviors. But beyond that, we got to recognize that attitudes can exist at two levels. And this is something that's very important to understand. In the same way we have explicit and implicit motivations, we have explicit and implicit attitudes. An explicit attitude is going to be something that is consciously held. It's going to be consciously accessed and expressed, right? And it's going to be controlled in our processing because we're going to be talking about it and we're going to be able to kind of divert what we say. So for instance, if you are in a group of people and, right, say, oh, what's a good example? So there used to be these two chicken restaurants at Texas A&M. They were both literally just places to get chicken strips. And one of them was Raising Cane's, which maybe some of you know of. And the other one was a local place called Lane's, Laynes. And the reason I say this is because people were super intense about which one they liked. And this was like beyond like your Coke and Pepsi type thing. And what you see, though, is that say I am a huge fan of one of those restaurants and I walk into a room full of people who aren't fans of that. And they say, hey, Kyle, which one do you like? And I say, well, which one do you guys like? And they all say, right, Raising Cane's. And then say I'm a Lane's fan. I might change my explicit attitude. I might change what I say here. And I might be like, yeah, I definitely like Raising Cane's. And it's consciously what I'm saying, and it's controlled because I'm choosing to do that. But I could also theoretically share my explicit attitude being that, no, I like the other restaurant better. That's my own belief. But we also have this idea of implicit attitudes, right? So explicit attitudes, we can kind of control what we say or what people think we mean. And then we have implicit attitudes, right, which are involuntary or uncontrollable with this automatic processing, and they can be unconscious. Well, which of these is stronger? I want you guys to tell me. That's my first video lecture question for you. So which attitude type do you think is stronger? Implicit attitudes or explicit attitudes? And why do you think they are? So go ahead and answer that, and we will move on from there. Alrighty then. So where do attitudes come from? We're still talking about this idea of implicit and explicit attitudes. They can match or mismatch, right? So you might act like you love your job, and then you can actually not love your job. Shocker. I know some of you in the food service industry, God bless you. You are amazing people. But what benefits is it to hold this mismatch? Well, social appearance. Any other reasons you can think of? Well, one that I love is this idea that, if you have to, if your friend shows you a video they really like and it's not funny at all, you might be tempted to laugh just to kind of make them feel better. And so now your implicit and explicit attitudes are definitely different. But we'll talk about plenty of situations kind of as we go on. And one of the biggest ones is when we talk about prejudice and discrimination, when we talk about how attitudes can be different. But what's really cool about this is when we ask to justify why we feel a way about something, we're not super good at it. So for instance, in this one study by Wilson et al., looking at how our attitudes towards a relationship are, students were just students who were in a relationship were asked about their partner. And the first group was asked to just give an overall evaluation. Hey, you are with a significant other. How would you describe your relationship? And the second group was asked to list reasons you feel the way you do about this relationship. So why is it that you like your partner? So how are you and your partner generally, group 1, or group 2, list the reasons you feel this way. And then they were asked to evaluate the relationship and then check their relationship, how they were doing 9 months later. What you see is a very stark difference here. What you see here is actually this idea that for the overall condition, right, they tended to be more likely to be together with their partner, and they also considered their relationship more stable, and they were more likely to stick together over those 9 months. Whereas when you're asked to list the reasons why you like something, you're less likely. So what's the reasoning behind that? Well, sometimes we misinterpret why we have an attitude, right? Sometimes we think we have an attitude because of one thing, but in fact, it's because something else. And it's really difficult. It's a lot of introspection and understanding why you like what you do. Oftentimes, it's not useful to think that way, but sometimes it is. So this is all kind of understanding what attitudes are, but how do we measure them? Let's talk about that for a minute. Well, the first way we can measure attitudes is pretty simple. We can just use direct measure. It's like it's a Likert type scale. Likert is actually the name of the guy who came up with this scale, and that's that kind of 7-point scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So we can ask you, hey, how much do you like President Trump, or how much do you prefer Joe Biden to be president, or right? These are pretty much what you see in polling examples nowadays, right? Or right, what is your attitude towards X, Y, and Z? Okay, sure. We can get some explicit measures that way. But we also have indirect measures, which are really cool. So we can have behavioral observations, right? So how you actually act. And in one study, one of my favorite studies that we can talk about is this idea that sometimes better than measuring direct attitudes, your explicit attitudes, is seeing how people do things in a situation. And what they did was they asked people for their attitudes on different races and how they felt about different races. And they were going to have a discussion with somebody on stereotyping in the U.S. And this was a while ago now. But what they did was they told some people that they were going to be working with another white partner. These were all white individuals. And some people, they were going to be working with a black partner. And then what they did was they said, hey, so you're going to be working with this other person. They are white or black. And now what I want you to do is, could you go grab 2 chairs? And there's the camera over there. So why don't you just set up the 2 chairs so we can sit there and see what you talk about? And what they measured was how far the chairs were apart from one another at the beginning of this. Because when when somebody's putting down these chairs, they're deciding how far apart you want to be. And what they found was people who were more afraid of coming off as racist, who were probably less likely to be racist, would put the chairs further from each other than people who were more likely to be openly racist or less likely to be concerned with being considered racist. So that's a great way to do this behavioral measure, right, is use the chairs. We can also talk about physiological measures. So having people look at different things like, different images that might cause reactions and seeing what their brain is actually doing. And then this idea of response latency, or the IAT, the implicit attitudes test. Now, do these all measure the same types of attitudes? I don't think so at all, right? Because these are very different measures, but they all give us an idea. And some might be more useful than others, and we can discuss why. Some might be better than others in certain situations, but these are all tools in a toolbox to understand attitudes. So the next VLQ I want you to answer is this question. So you can just put VLQ2, A, B, C, or D. You don't even need to write out the response. So Peter wants to measure both implicit and explicit attitudes to see if they match. Peter should use blank to measure implicit attitudes and blank to measure explicit attitudes, A, B, C, or D. I trust that you all can read, so I will go ahead and put a break in the video right here, and you guys can continue on when you are ready. For those of you curious, it was C. So the one way that I want to talk about the attitude measurements in the most interesting one, I think, is this idea of the implicit association test, the IAT, implicit association or implicit attitudes test. And the IAT is very, very unique. I think it's a very cool way to measure these things. And the idea is that, for instance, you're going to be asked to sort things into categories if you do the IAT. And so you might have to sort things into men versus women in this idea of leaders versus followers. Now, what they're doing here is they're setting you up to kind of understand how you match these certain things together, right? So, right, men are often paired with leaders more than women being paired with leaders. And it might be the case that in your mind, implicitly, you have a stronger association between men and followers than you do women and followers. In the same way, you have a stronger association between peanut butter and jelly than you have peanut butter and butter. So what they do is they will ask people, right, okay, so, following these reaction time kind of experiments, classify this as leader or follower, classify this as men and women. And what they do is they ask you to put them in different categories as fast as you can. And what it does is it lets us measure how closely two implicit concepts are related in our mind. Right? As I mentioned, if I say peanut butter, you are most likely to say jelly instead of butter. And so it might be easier to categorize male and leader than it will be to categorize male and follower or female and leader. So this is one way to do this. Now, this is not the only way, but this is one way to do this. And so what this looks like, let's do an example here, is this idea. So pair words together here. So if it's, and just play along, I guess, put your hand up at home, or if you're in public, I guess just ignore me. But, right, so when I'm going to throw a word on the screen, and I want you to quickly choose, is it the good or the bad? Normally, you would do this by hitting one of your shift keys on your computer. So the left shift would be good, the right shift would be bad, etc. So go ahead. Wonderful. It's a good word. Hopefully you got that. Agony. It's a bad word. Now, let's try this with some people instead. We've got Justin Timberlake and Justin Bieber. So if it's Justin Timberlake, go to that side. If it's Justin Bieber, go to this side. I can't tell which is left and right for you guys. So Justin Timberlake. Oh, excuse me, I shouldn't say that. Put him here. Put that one there. So now we've done kind of the basics. So this is the equivalent of male, female, follower, and leader. Do you see what this looks like here? So how fast do you put good words into the same category as Justin Timberlake, and how fast do you put bad words in the same category as Justin Bieber? Right, so laughter. So that's right. So that I kind of went pretty fast there, but the idea here being like good, bad, bad. Well, I say bad category should be Justin Bieber and Justin Timberlake. But the idea is now if we switched Justin Timberlake and Justin Bieber, would it be harder for you, say you don't like Justin Bieber, would it be harder for you to pair good words and Justin Bieber together than it is for you to pair good words and Justin Timberlake together? So it might look something like this on the screen, right? If it's male, put it here. If it's female, put it here. If it's career, put it here. If it's family, put it here. We also talked about a similar one, right? It wasn't the IAT, but this idea of the shooter bias study works here. Right? So you might have to put white or bad together, black or good, and then you might have to put together black or bad and white or good. So we already kind of went through this. Again, I showed you we switched these, but what I want you guys to do is I want you to take one of these IATs. It takes about 5 minutes. It shouldn't be that bad. And I want to be able to talk about this in class because it's a really interesting concept to me, and it's a really unique finding what we do see. So I do encourage you to, I'm requiring you to take this, and I do encourage you to talk about your results. I'm going to talk about my results in class. I did a white versus black IAT, and I once had to do a white versus black IAT in a group in class where my partner was African American, and that made me feel very uncomfortable based on my results, where I was slightly biased towards white people. And we'll describe why that is and what that really means. Before I go any further, just because I was biased towards white people on an implicit level does not necessarily mean that makes me a racist or makes me a bad person. And we'll talk about really what it means to have this implicit bias. So if you do have an implicit bias in a way that you feel isn't right, we'll spend some time digging into this issue in class. How about that? All right. Spent a lot of time on that. Now let's go to attitudes and behavior and figuring out when attitudes actually predict our behaviors. So do they, first of all? And the question that I always come back to is, why do we do one thing and say another sometimes, right? Thinking about things like pollution, right? 92% of Americans believe it's a bad thing based on the day, but less than 50% do anything beyond recycling. And not even many people do recycling. How about honesty, right? Are you an honest person, right? Do your attitudes towards honesty, being honest is good, predict your behavior, being honest? We know people value honesty, but 91% of people admit to lying regularly. And volunteering, we know a lot of people agree to volunteer, but only 30% or 33% actually volunteer at all. I don't know if you know about John Edwards. John Edwards was a Democratic senator. He was a Democratic politician, I can give you that much. And he had a terrible, terrible scandal. So on top of this, he decided to have an extramarital affair with a woman while his wife was sick with cancer. Had a kid with this extramarital affair during this extramarital affair, and continued to basically go behind his wife, even when she had cancer again after it came and went back. And here's what he says is, I've been in love with the same woman for 30 plus years. As anyone who's been around us knows, she's an extraordinary human being, warm, loving, beautiful, sexy, and as good a person as I have ever known. Okay, then why did you do it? And this is really an interesting thing because, first of all, it doesn't matter what side of the political aisle you are on. That's kind of a scummy thing to do. But generally, the point being here that, why would you say one thing and do another? It's such an interesting concept. Well, there's a lot of reasons. There's a lot, and we can discuss them in class, and I think we should. But one thing we found is that situations matter a lot. So in 1934, LaPierre did a study traveling with a Chinese couple. So think about the time period. There's an extreme prejudice against Asian Americans. If we think to what ends up happening in World War II, we actually put a lot of Japanese in concentration camps. Now, these are Japanese, not Chinese, but as we know from some of the things that people did during the coronavirus opening, there was a huge increase in prejudice towards anybody of Asian descent. So does it really matter if they were Chinese or not? It's thing. But what they did was they had LaPierre call ahead for each of these restaurants and said, "Hi, my name is so-and-so, and I am calling because I am traveling with a Chinese couple, companions. I am interested to know, would you allow us to eat at your restaurant? Because I know there's kind of a big backlash to this." Think about the time period, right? And what they found was very, very interesting. They ended up visiting, additionally, 251 establishments. So not only did they ask people, but they actually went to places. They were only turned away at one establishment. Excuse me, I get these mixed up. 6 months later, they contacted all those same establishments and said, "Hey, I'm traveling with this Chinese couple. Would you let us eat here?" Right? Recognizing that the people who showed up were a well-dressed couple. They were not in this very stereotypical 1930s understanding of what a Chinese person would look like. There was a white professional with them. This wasn't a true experiment either. But what they found was that 92% of people who responded said, "No, you will not. You will not be allowed to eat at our restaurant." Bro, we were there 6 months ago. What happened? Right? Why this discrepancy? Well, because there's not much attitude and behavior consistency between us. Go back to the fundamental attribution error. Why did you do this? You're going to explain it away in whatever way you can to make yourself feel good. You are going to go with what makes sense to you. Just because we have an attitude for something, whether that be for it or against it, it doesn't mean we will automatically trigger this behavior, right? The situation very much matters. For instance, just because I play video games every once in a while does not mean I am going to just become the laziest piece of garbage on earth and never leave my room. Social norms play a role, right? I know that I shouldn't take a phone call in a movie theater, right? But maybe it's something I really want to do, and I have to kind of argue against myself against it. So I know that I shouldn't answer my phone in a movie theater, but what if it's my mom calling and she's called now 3 times? Should I pick up? I mean, don't do that. Leave the theater, please. But what we know is that people take the situation into account only when they're in the situation and need to make that choice, right? Attitudes don't always predict behavior. It's not a great way to do it. So they do sometimes. And one way we know that they do is whether this is spontaneous or planned. With spontaneous behaviors, these are snap decisions, right? They predict behavior only if it's a highly accessible attitude, right? So only if it makes sense. So think back to this attitude accessibility we kind of talked about earlier with the implicit attitudes, right? If the strength of that association between our attitude and our object of evaluation, whatever it might be, is very strong, it's going to come to mind quicker, right? So, for instance, I'm not a fan of the Steelers. It's just where I grew up. We were not Steelers fans. I've seen Steelers bumper stickers down here, and even when I see them, I just kind of like, Steelers fans. And really the important thing to understand with that is this idea that if it's highly motivated, if it's kind of primed in a sense, or at the top of our mind, it's more likely to be used. But when we do deliberative behaviors or thoughtful decisions, right, this is going to be a bit different. This is going to be less about accessibility and more about what we call the theory of planned behavior. And the theory of planned behavior says behaviors generally come from what we call behavioral intentions. So the reason you do things are often, or planned behaviors, we should say, the reason you study is because you have the intention to study, right? So you have a couple different things that help you for the intention to study for your exam. Your attitude towards the behavior. Look, I know you guys probably don't love to study. I get it, right? But there's still some other reasons that you would study, even though your attitude's like, I don't like to study. Maybe a subjective norm. You believe that studying is what's important to get good grades. It is. And that's going to help you to recognize that, hey, maybe I should do this behavioral intention of study. And then this idea of perceived behavioral control. So perceived behavioral control is how much control do you have over this behavior? How much control do you think or perceive you have over this behavior? Well, studying isn't that hard. Hopefully. I mean, you sit down, read the book, watch the lectures, take some notes, right? Ask some questions, look into things. But if you are somebody who doesn't believe you can do that, right, you're not going to make that behavioral intention. So for instance, if you are somebody who can't ride a bike, right? Maybe you want to ride a bike, you have a positive attitude. Maybe the subjective norm is, hey, it's okay to ride bikes. But if you don't think you can ride a bike, it's going to be very hard to get you to ride a bike without either, just like to go ride a bike, but you might have an intention to start trying to ride a bike. Things like this matter, and recognizing that it's not just how accessible our attitudes are, but a lot of different things might play a role here. Now, we know one way that we can get our attitudes to predict behavior is when they're formed by direct experience. And Fazio and a couple colleagues did this really interesting study about having students sleep on a cot. And this is kind of the exact opposite of the dorm situation we're going in now, that some students actually had to sleep in cots on Cornell's campus due to some housing shortage, right? So some people had to sleep on these dorm lounges or cots for several weeks, but some people had dorms already, right? There were a lot of people there. Now, of course, nobody's going to have a positive attitude towards this, right? Even if you have a room, you're probably going to feel pretty crappy about that. So when asked about the attitudes towards the university handling the situation, all students, regardless of where they were sleeping, said, this sucks. We don't like this. This is terrible. They had a negative attitude towards the campus administration and the situation in general. Now, they also said, okay, so would you sign a letter to the campus to say, hey, we're really upsetting. We're going to sign a petition and, take some form of action. You join a committee or, you can write a letter. What you saw is that only the people who slept on cots were willing to actually sign a letter, right? So it's this direct experience of having done this. This is the same example of, right, if you see somebody broken down on the side of a road, right, you might say, man, that sucks. I hope somebody helps them. Bye, as you continue driving. You're not going to stop, or most people don't, but maybe you're more likely to stop if this has ever happened to you, right? Suggesting that this is going to be a very important thing to recognize is how personally relevant this is. Going back to what we talked about in Chapter 3, that personal relevance means a lot here. Now, lastly, when do these predict behavior? When our cognitive and affective components match, when the C and the A match for the B, right? So, for instance, our cognitive component might be, right, is this a dangerous thing I'm about to do? My affective component might be, am I afraid, right? Figuring this out. And my behavior might be, should I run away? So, to decide on my behavior, I have to know my cognitions and my affect towards it. Mr. Bear here, is this dangerous? I would say so. Am I afraid? I would think so. Should I run? Absolutely. This guy, is it dangerous? No. Am I afraid? Not really. Do I run away? Probably not. Here, is it dangerous? I'm not sure. Am I afraid? Not really. I'm going to keep my distance, right? My behavior, I might not run away, but it's a bit more ambiguous here. So when these components conflict, which one wins? Well, it depends on the behavior, right? So, right, this is a snake, right? So when we have these kind of conflicting issues here, is it dangerous? Let's just say no. Am I afraid? Yes, maybe in this case, right? Well, if we are talking about consumptive behaviors, so behaviors that are, kind of motivated as an end in and of itself, right? Consuming ice cream or getting something you might need, right? Affect is a better predictor. But how about instrumental behavior we might talk about? So behavior that we actually need to, right, do something. Studying is an instrumental behavior. That's more extrinsically motivated. I don't want to study. I don't like to study, but I need to study in order to get a good grade. So our cognitive component might be a better predictor. So my affect in this example, great example here, right? I don't want to study. Well, your affect might be going, studying's boring, it's not fun, I don't like it. Where your cognitions might sit there and say, well, but I need to study so I get good grades. I know it sucks, but toughen up, buttercup, we have to go study. And that's going to be a better predictor. Now, on the other hand, like, oh, I really, really want to eat this delicious ice cream and I had a really bad day and I could really use a treat. Well, your cognition might be like, yeah, well, don't you not want to go over calories? And you might say, yeah, but I'm hungry. And so if you're really having a bad day, maybe your affect is a better predictor. Now, you could, right? We know people can overcome these, cravings or what have you, and do the harder thing, right? Ignoring your affect, even if you're tired, continuing to push on or ignoring, right, a cognition. We know some people run into burning buildings. Why they might do that. So recognizing that these are useful, but not not the linchpin, not the quintessential thing. There are ways around this, as most things in psychology. And so when do attitudes predict behavior? Well, actually when appropriate measures are used. And by that we mean the same level of specificity. So what's interesting is if you ask somebody, right, do you like baseball? So do you like the Ch7 baseball team? Or actually, we'll just say more broad, do you like baseball? So I like baseball just as much as anybody else. I'm not a huge sports fan, but I have a generally positive attitude towards baseball. I like it. My cognitions towards baseball are, it's a fine sport. My behaviors towards baseball, I'd probably watch it, probably go to a game. But the difference is, what if I asked you, right, so will you go to a Ch7 baseball game? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to spend my time doing that. I very well might. But the idea is that's a very different level of specificity, right, than what you might ask. How do you feel about the Ch7 baseball team? Like, oh, I mean, I don't really know. don't know much. I'm a new faculty member here. Like, okay, so will you be likely to go to that game? And I'm not really sure because I don't know much about it. Versus, like, hey, do you like the Stetson baseball team? Oh, I love them. So will you go to a Stetson baseball game? Absolutely. And so we can talk about how this level of specificity of what you're measuring really matters. So think about this, right? We use multiple criteria. There's many different attitudes and behaviors that help us to understand what we do, right? And so if we want to kind of look at how people recycle, right? Maybe we want to measure not just recycling or like, how we feel about this, but we might measure it in a lot of different ways. How do you feel about recycling? Oh, I definitely think we should. Well, do you recycle? Well, yes. But do you go out and clean up? So, no. Well, how about, change different electrical stuff or try to keep the lights off in order to save energies? Well, no. So recognizing that maybe there's multiple criteria that help us understand these things. In that not only that the level of specificity in which we ask matters. And to dig more on this idea of specificity, there was this really interesting study, right, that if we want to predict a specific behavior, we want to use specific attitudes, not the general attitudes. And what you found here is, look at these correlational differences. If we are looking specifically on whether or not somebody is going to get a birth control or be on birth control pills, women, obviously, this is probably a good reason why LaPierre didn't get a similar response. He asked the general question, do you how do you feel if somebody came in here versus can I eat here? So married women and whether or not they had used birth control in the last 2 years. So how do you feel about birth control? Is only less than a 0.1 R value of correlation between whether you've used birth control and your attitude towards birth control, all the way up to what's the likelihood that you'll use birth control in the next 2 years? Well, women who were on birth control had a stronger attitude towards that. We're more likely to do that. So recognizing that if we want to know a specific attitude, we have to ask about that specific attitude itself, not generally, right? So in the same way that maybe you really like rom-coms, but there's one you don't like. If your date asks you, hey, do you like rom-coms? You might say, yeah. And then they decide to show you this one that you don't like. Well, they never asked about that specific one, which you have a different attitude towards, right? And not the general attitude. Hopefully that helps. If not, ignore me. Let's move on to attitude change and how do attitudes change? And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about cognitive dissonance. So what I want you guys to do is just write about a time that your actions contradicted your attitudes, beliefs, or feelings. And how did it make you feel? And what did you do to reduce those feelings? So go ahead and write about that for a little bit, and then come back and we will hit play. All right. So I love this quote by Maya Angelou that really talks about this idea of attitudes, right? If you don't like something, change it. And if you can't change it, change your attitude. So how do we do this and how do we change our attitude? Well, we'll see if we even do that. So we talked about cognitive dissonance a little at the very beginning of class, and here's where we're going to spend some more time and weave in some of that other stuff we talked about regarding how attitudes change. Now, we talked about Leon Festinger, who joined this call. They said the end of the world was going to happen on December 21st, 1954. I wonder if it did or not. But this was going to happen due to a great flood, and a flying saucer was going to come down and save these people in this cult. And what was really interesting that a lot of her followers had abandoned everything they owned. They had sold their house, quit their jobs, they had no money. And what Leon was interested in is what happens when the saucer doesn't come? Well, Festinger predicted an increased commitment, which makes no sense. So you told me that the flying saucer was going to be here December 21st, and it wasn't. So what's going to happen? Well, that night, there was no flood, and the leader of the cult, Marian Keech, said, we must have prayed so hard, the world was saved. And what you saw was that many of these people who were new and hadn't given up a lot of their life to this said, nah, bro, and kind of just ducked. And we're like, no way, this is ridiculous. I don't believe you for a second. But the people who were there the longest were most likely to stick around. Our behavior can influence our attitudes. Why? Well, we don't like to be wrong. We want to rationalize our behavior to reduce inconsistencies between our attitudes and our behaviors. We want to maintain cognitive consistency. We want to be consistent. We don't want to flip-flop. And here's the thing about life. There's often times where something makes sense in one place and it doesn't in another, right? If you said, I shouldn't, right, there is no reason to ever be violent. Absolutely not a reason to be violent. You're missing out on a time where, right, what if somebody attacks you and you have to fight back, right? These are the things that make people, that's difficult to think about because we want simple and easy rules. We want to be as quick and as easy and efficient in our judgments as not. So we know in the same way that when you say, I will do anything whatever you want, I will do anything for you. And then people go, anything? What we mean there is, right, I will do most things within reason. And so when we say these things like I will do anything, we run into this idea of cognitive dissonance because now there's an inconsistency that's detected. I love this comic, right? Unfortunately, this is how the brain works is that, right, hey, we're receiving information that conflicts with our belief systems. Okay, get rid of it. This tweet I saw sums it up fantastically, right? This guy on the internet said, people change their minds when you show them facts. And this person said, that's not actually true, right? Here are some studies that show you that, right, cognitive dissonance means that you, right, don't change your minds. And then he goes, yeah, well, I still think it works.
Upgraded that, so we have to bet the upgrade. Mind.
So what we're going to talk about with cognitive dissonance is a very, very powerful tool
6, 7,
in our
9,
arsenal
8, 10 got there. Very
us,
unlikely. Flush draw has not got there, so we're going to increase 73%.
Make sense of the world in a way that's helpful to us.
I block an 8 as well, actually, which is
it can
really nice.
Be really
I still
bad,
have my open ending.
Right? It can be this kind of thing where we avoid certain information because we want to feel
I'm basically all in.
And it's difficult. So when we talk about this idea of cognitive dissonance, it's the idea that this inconsistency between our thoughts, our sentiments, our beliefs, and our actions creates.
By the way, when I talk out loud, I'm not trying to teach you guys. I'm just saying what goes through my head.
Right, dissonance.
I've got this guy covered a lot. So if he jams here, I'm just going to call and hope he's on a draw.
Poured together
but I do have a 10 blocked as well.
On like a piano, right? If you just press two notes and they didn't go together very well, right? It makes this bad noise that we don't like. And so what happens is when an inconsistency is detected, we change something in our attitude or our behavior to get consistency back, and we look for what is easier. So what's easier to change? The behavior you just did or an attitude that you have? Well, let's talk about it here. So with cognitive elements, we have things like knowledge, beliefs, attitudes, and behavior, all of which are relative to one another. So, for instance, we know that we should drive safe. We know that driving safe is very important, and that driving safely reduces car accidents.
It's fine.
We can also have some irrelevant details, right? Like we also have knowledge in our mind that, like, I like ice cream. That's not relevant to what we're talking about here.
He has this whole tournament, $5,200 here. He's considering those, so we might actually have
where we
like
drive safe.
9 maybe, but then I could have ace-8. You could have ace-8.
Where we
the jacks would
text
have
and
some
drive
lots,
apparently back in 2006
so I think we get that one
with this image.
Okay, that was good.
What happens when we have this idea that, safe driving is very important. You shouldn't text and drive. And then you check your phone while you're driving.
I know, it's so annoying.
This causes dissonance.
If anyone's joined, if anyone's a poker regular, you might see that this man's purple. Purple in my labels means
and driving safe involves not checking your phone.
Like he could have a freaking
then you went and checked your phone. So I can't go back on my behavior.
I will play. It's just a joke.
But I can change my attitude a little bit easier.
Okay, so we're still playing okay. Still playing okay, I think. What was that hand that just happened, actually?
I have parents. Both my parents
smoke. I lost a load of chips.
And I think it's very silly that they do that. And we know that smoking causes cancer. And my parents smoke, right? And there you have these dissonant cognitions. Anytime you bring it up to them, it goes, well, don't you know that's bad for you? Like, well, yeah, but I don't want to think about it. This causes cognitive dissonance. So what can they do?
Yeah,
what can my parents do?
Well, they could, I got moved to another table.
Yeah, they could just, right?
Alrighty, who are we against? Some mountain? Who are these guys?
But that's not what they're going to do. They're probably going to change their cognition.
Millennium ace, you ain't dealt no aces, mate.
It won't happen to me. It might not happen to me. They could change your behavior, not smoke.
No more Megalodon.
Or they could add a consonant cognition, right? They might add a kind of you can think of these almost like excuses, right? Well, I only do it because it relaxes me, so that makes it okay.
I mean,
whether that's true or not,
AI,
we don't know, but we see that people
I don't know, man.
will make these cognitions like this.
Poke and I've got ace high. Like,
additionally, I'm really interested in how we as human beings make decisions.
So much like human.
And we make a lot of decisions in our life, right? You guys chose where to go to college already. What major should you pick? Should you join a sorority or a fraternity? Where should you live? And what happens is, after we make a decision,
there's too much human in the game.
We often decide, okay, that was the right decision. So the state of psychological dissonance that occurs after making an important decision. So you make a decision, and you have to choose one thing over another, and you're not sure if you made the right decision. So your mind says,
as soon as he bet into me, but I
that was the right decision. So in one study, Knox and Inkster,
so if I get about 4.5 to 1 with the King 9, the only downside is if I do hit the King.
Show up, or they had people record how confident they were in their bets at a horse track race, both before and after they placed their bets. So asking,
it's
how
cheap
likely is
lines
it that
right
your
now,
horse
so if I have
will
6-7 and under the gun raises and I somehow hit like straight draw or whatever, it misses him, but he will realistically then have 2 overcards, which aren't paired, assuming he doesn't have that. And then if he has that, he's going to be calling up C-betting almost every time.
People who vote for a candidate are more confident in their candidate
kind of hoping to hit though, but the hand has a lot of potential. Like, so if you even if I play, I think what 7-8 is the highest card that beats aces.
You vote.
If that guy opens with aces and I play 6-7, and 6-7 hits
after you
5-4-7
than before you voted. Why?
He misses so hard.
Because you can't go backwards in time.
So hard.
What's the easiest target to be consistent on?
Unless he has an overpair.
You can't change your behavior, but you can change your attitude.
I wouldn't play it if I was earlier
position. You say, I'm all in on this one, okay? I said this was the right answer, so I'm going to go with it. Now, people can be wrong and can own up to that. And that's really a mature skill that people have. Being able to recognize, I made a mistake, I was wrong.
I was only thinking that's the only hand that beats me.
But not everybody is willing to make these changes.
In the heat of the moment, I wasn't thinking.
So it might come down to the case where, right, these bettors say,
if I thought that, I might have
they might lose and they might go, well, I actually knew it wasn't going to be that horse, but I was just hoping it was. And making these kind of fibs or lies up in their head. So when does this occur? After important decisions, right? Permanent decisions as well. And then when we've got equally attractive alternatives, right? When both things are about equal. Now, if you spend $100,000 and you buy a really crappy car for that much money versus $100,000 and get a really nice car, I don't know why I said $100,000. You're gonna probably feel crappy, right? Because you're not talking about like equally attractive alternatives. You're talking about a much worse alternative compared to a better one. But at the end of the day, Macs and PCs, more or less, most people just spend their time on Facebook or Reddit or whatever it is anyway, so it doesn't really matter unless you're playing video games.
I could set mine, but I don't want any like...
and that's... One is better for one. You can figure out which. I don't get paid to show for either of them.
Now, I've got this guy coming to me,
rationalize cognitive dissonance? How do we do this? Well, you can also see this.
The only scary thing now is if he calls
in your book, and I think it's a really really interesting study. It's by the first author of the textbook, Aaron.
If he has the queen, so be it.
The idea was he was a student of Leon Festinger's actually, and he wanted to conduct a study on people being initiated into groups. So he recruited young women at Stanford to look at how these dynamics of group discussion processes work. And they were going to be discussing the psychology of sex.
Speaking of Queen 5. He would have snapped called the Queen of 5, but if he just has it on that flop,
in order to help the students be as open and frank as possible, quote unquote, the discussion would take place in such a way that people couldn't see each other, and each participant was basically in a separate room and talking via an intercom system, allowing people to express their thoughts freely. Now, this helps people relax and maximize participation.
I do believe, in all honesty, the 5.2K, it says late registration.
All participants said, yeah, I'll be able to talk about sex freely. And they were told that despite some precautions in the past, that some people still had difficulty and could be really embarrassed. So they implemented this embarrassing screening, this kind of screening, they said. So what the difference was a severe, a mild, or no screening, right? So some people just said, all right, get in there and discuss.
Oh, no, not this shit.
Now, in the mild screening, they were asked to read words like prostitute, virgin, and petting, all of which are somewhat sexual in nature, or, well, but like maybe not as bad. And if you got kids in the room or you don't want to hear some naughty words, you might want to not not mute or unmute me until I put something else on the screen. I'll give you a second to do that for whatever reason. But in the severe condition,
best player in
we had words
I don't
like
think got knocked out. Wait, Ben got knocked out. I don't think he did. I just got changed name.
And they had to read 2 passages from contemporary novels that contain sex scenes to the experimenter. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm already uncomfortable saying the F word in the other words that I said to you guys. I couldn't imagine how difficult it would be to say, like speak a passage out loud of a sexual, like it was in this sexual nature to this somebody discussing this.
No, sorry, bet call.
But what's interesting is everybody then listened to a boring sex
I just
discussion.
don't know if that would add up.
It wasn't interesting at all. It wasn't about human sex. It was actually about sexual behavior in animals, and actually because they hadn't completed an assigned reading, they weren't actually going to participate in the discussion, but just listen in for the first session. And
chess AI. Well, no, chess. I honestly believe an AI eventually could genuinely solve chess. Queen Jack.
They asked people how interesting did you find this study.
No river card.
It's interesting how interesting they found it, if you ask me.
What the hell?
So in the control group,
who do I know? I don't know any of these
people
guys.
said, yeah, I was pretty interested in this. I mean, it was cool. It was something.
Sort this table out with some shoehorns
and then,
whatnot.
In the mildly suggestive condition, people said, I mean, it was kind of interesting. But in the sexually explicit condition,
this dude over here.
Said it was more interesting.
Did Ben bust out? I don't know, mate. He's live right now. Twitch.tv/raise your edge. So you can go watch him if you want. He's very, very good. Very good.
Well, I just embarrassed myself by reading this stupid material that was a lot of effort just to join this group. But the group discussion was really dull and boring. I now have these 2 issues in my head, which is causing me dissonance. So, what is easier to change? Your attitude, your cognitions, or your behavior? Or excuse me, I guess your affect, your cognitions, or your behavior.
Bust it out?
Well, you can change your affect and our cognitions a lot easier.
Where
than
am I?
our behavior.
Megalodon free roll. I'm in 84th position of 114, so I'm almost on the short stack.
I actually thought that
if I survive till 72nd, I make $12 though. But I'm not trying to survive right now. I'm just playing. I'm playing very.
Recognizing with that we are going to rationalize our decisions in a way that makes us feel better about whatever we did. So the reason we rationalize these things are this idea of effort justification. We want to increase liking for something that we've worked hard to attain for. This is, if you've heard of, and I can't think of it now,
horseshoe my home.
The sunk cost fallacy, this idea that you have spent too much time on something already, so we're going to keep going with it. I've sunk enough time in here, I might as well continue on. What happens is, especially when these things turn out to be unpleasant or boring, we're going to change our effort justification. We're going to justify why we did this. So some examples of this, right? If you get a new dog and you have a lot of problems with it, you might say, well, that's just because I love them.
So if I have like 6-figure chips,
right? If you decide to join a fraternity that hazes you a lot, or a sorority that hazes you a lot,
like the one with the red background. So you can see how this one looks like way more colorful. So if I'm on the bleak one, this is the free roll. This one's the 5200.
It had to be for some reason.
At the bottom left, you can see I folded a pretty trash hands. This one was
on here as somebody who has a newborn, right? I go through a lot of effort to keep my baby alive, and so I have to justify that I
don't know with the activation.
I guess this would suggest I justify loving my baby a lot because you know, hey, it was a lot of work to do this.
I still think I'm playing fine.
But that makes a lot of sounds. And the important thing to recognize about this is
it'll pause after 8 hours of play. That's so annoying, man. How do you cash in the 5200? I've got to play it for 2 days.
Would you feel better about lying to a stranger if I paid you $1 or if I paid you $20? And then I answer a similar question. Under which conditions would you change your attitude after lying to a stranger?
Could just get a fold from this dude.
If I gave you $1 or if I gave you $20?
Only downside is I obviously have 7s and 9s, which I'm probably not
his range anymore. In this
so we could have like a really be afraid of that 10. I once again was the pre-flop aggressor.
So what he did with this was he did this boring task involving turning pegs. Basically, you just had to sit there and turn these pegs.
He folded last time, so he calls that he might have it in something. I blocked the 6s, so he doesn't really have a draw. Unless he has like ace-5, ace-2.
Where they said, hey, by the way, can you just go tell this next person, right, that,
got nothing.
Go ahead and tell this next group that this is a really fun task, please.
Well, no, I'm happy with both of those.
So just lie for me for free. Then there was a condition, hey, can you give me, I'll give you $1 if you go tell the group, the guy coming in next, that this is a fun study, and I'll give you $20 if you tell me,
enjoy this, guys! Exclamation mark! Home games. Feel free to join our home game, and you'll be able to play the next one for absolutely nothing, maybe.
Well, interesting findings here.
Also, make sure you don't hit the follow button because you might lose. There's also a guy called K. Kona King who's still booming.
The task a lot less compared to
Lord
other
Wellington
people.
is smashing.
Excuse me. The $20 condition, compared to others, they found it okay. It wasn't that bad. It wasn't that great. But when it was only $1 they earned, they found the task to be much more interesting. How does this work? We're rationalizing. We've got this task was really boring.
It's got an ad for Trojan condoms on my channel. Really, mate? That is the biggest waste of ad revenue budget I've ever heard.
And then this is going to cause us dissonance, right? But when we have money, it makes the dissonance go away. When we don't have money, maybe that task was really fun. I can assume, right? Yeah, that task was boring, but I got $20 out of it, so it doesn't matter if it was boring or not.
Got this on the big.
Here,
I don't
have to explain why I did what I did.
Nice to have
and again, we're not good at explaining our behavior, so I might say, well,
ace
I
is
must really
dangerous
liked it if I lied for $1.
That could be against the better ace.
With this, right, when does this cause dissonance? When do all of these things cause dissonance? Well, the one that we just talked about is this idea of insufficient justification. There's less incentive for the behavior, so there's more dissonance, right? You might be a very, very good person, but this is almost like everybody has their price. So at what point are you willing to make a dissonant decision for money?
But I think it's fine to fold my A7.
I guess like an extreme example is like, how much money would it take for me to sell my child? I love my child. I love my daughter. But right, theoretically, you know, I wouldn't sell her ever. But maybe there's a certain amount that I could get away with.
It's quite early, but we'll open the Ch7 hit.
And it would make me understand and maybe change my attitude. I never loved her anyways because I now have $1 billion or something. That's terrible and not true at all, and not something you should do. But that's the idea of this insufficient justification. There's also this idea of threat or orders of obedience, right? If you're threatened to do a behavior, you experience less dissonance. This is that I was following orders. I didn't want to do this, but if I didn't do it, right? In World War II, they would have killed you, for instance. About 17 bigs. And then with choice, right? If this behavior is freely chosen, we experience
could be the last hand if someone has magic, but
we are the ones who decided to do
let's go, bro.
If I told you to do this and you didn't like it, you can blame it on me. Right? But if you chose to do this and you didn't like it, you have to justify in your head why it wasn't that awful.
I got knocked out. Oh no,
deal with the fact that you chose poorly.
So 9-10 is extremely unlikely because I have a 10 in my hand. I do have this jack. He would always raise, I think, here. The only hands that would beat me now.
Let's move on to the last little bit of this lecture here, talking about self-perception theory.
It might be over.
This idea that we can look outward at our behavior in situational conflict to infer what our attitudes are. Coming back to chapter 3, right, we know that attitudes typically follow behavior. Right, my cat's named Zelda.
But the ace-10 shove there is fine. Like it was a flip and we just lost. Sorry, I'll show you the thing. I think it's fine to shove here for whatever bigs I've got. It's like 16 bigs. I shove ace-10 on the button. I think it's completely fine.
Maybe
fives on the big blind he calls.
Giving me golf stuff, for instance, for Father's Day, and I've golfed
horrible run out for ace-10.
Maybe I think I start really like. Maybe I start to think I really like golf, and that's the idea.
I don't think that's a misplay.
Right? Because our self-perception, right? Often our attitudes aren't very strong one way or another.
I might be busting soon though, guys. We're on 10 bigs. Shove any ace. Shove any ace right now.
But not only that, we see this idea of embodied cognition mattering, not just our attitudes, but what our body is doing, what our behaviors are. And this is that motor system that influences our cognition. We talked about that frown and smile study a little bit before. I think on the first day of class, the idea that, right, if you have people put a pencil between their teeth, they're smiling, versus between their lips, they have to frown. And
I'll leave my guy be, man. I was gonna go by
slight ability.
So I've got less than 10 big shots. Show before me, bro.
You may have heard
Is it over? No, I'm shoving it's over.
It's over. Salesmen might try to get you to nod along because that embodies this idea that you are agreeing.
Might not get a call, but this is completely fine.
And this comes from this study by Wells and Petty in 1980, where
nice, we got a call. Could still be behind though.
By listening to radio editorials.
Ace queen, nice. No queen. We got the ace there. Only a queen make we lose. No flush. We're fine. Right, good.
And they were asked their agreement with the editorial position.
Right, back here. We got 20 bigs now.
Nodding your head yes increases agreement, while shaking your head no decreases agreement. So again, even our behaviors, as small as shaking our head, can influence our attitudes towards things. But this isn't the only way that we can actually embody our cognition. We can do through things like our senses, actually smell. This is a very interesting study I found one time regarding how we can increase safe sex use, which increase so more or less.
Teriyaki salmon, slightly burnt. I'm really bad at cooking salmon recently.
Is really interesting to me for two reasons. One is the idea that we can actually use a sense of smell, what people smell, to increase the likelihood that they say they'll use condoms in the future. But two, because as you see in this third line here, their independent variable was a single pump of a liquid-ass novelty odor spray, which is maybe one of the funniest things that I've ever seen in a psychology study. So shout-outs to them. But there's also these things like movements. We can look at mouse tracking data and where people go and how quickly they go to one target has been shown to be very linked with how much you might consider this. What would be the word here? I apologize, I got a clearly fussy girl. This is a link to confidence in the target, into which they're choosing to see. We also see this not just with a mouse, but if you ask people to use a lever to push or pull things. So that has a role in this as well. And in class, I want you guys to be able to think of what are some phrases that might embody our cognitions. We have a lot of them that actually matter. So do keep that in mind as well. But with this broader rationalization, the last couple of things I want to talk about is that we don't just rationalize about ourselves and others in terms of the fundamental attribution error. As we talked about a little bit, we want to rationalize that the world is fair. Is the world is fair. So with people,
you guys might know more of these
this is the just world hypothesis, that people get what they should get. But with systems, larger things, we call this systems justification theory. So the idea that things like socio-political systems, so the way our society is set up, the way our politics are set up, that the way healthcare is distributed, the way money is distributed in this society is all the correct, fair, and legitimate way. It's the way we grew up, and it's worked so far, right? So it should just be good. Well, we see some interesting findings. So we know in the U.S. system there is a pay inequality gap, and a fair amount of women actually report that they don't deserve equal pay compared to men, suggesting that that they think they deserve less than men. A lot of low-income groups don't often support taxing the wealthy. Although it would have no negative benefit towards them and probably net positive benefits towards them, people don't like to support that. Suggesting that they want to stick with what is certain. It's almost like the devil that you know is better than the one that you don't.
I don't think I can see it.
And not only that, we also do these rationalizations in terms of compensatory stereotypes. So a stereotype that's kind of in compensation for a bad thing. So for those of us in less privileged roles, maybe I'm not exactly what you would call rich, we might find things that we benefit from not being rich, like poor people being happier than rich people. Well, I may be poor in money, but at least I'm rich in love. That's the idea going on with this idea of broader rationalization. But this kind of comes into the line of terror management theory, as we've mentioned before. And terror management theory is this idea that we have to deal with the fact that we're going to die someday. And that sucks. It's especially been relevant because we've had a lot of talk about death going on in our lives recently. And I just saw an article that said rates of depression are up specifically due to COVID and the news about COVID. And so what we do to kind of get rid of this, to manage this terror, we might strive for symbolic immortality through preserving either the world we live in as we know it,
my position was quite early though. Maybe because I was in a bit of an early position, I could just come in behind.
We try to live symbolically.
But it's more like I don't want to play Ace King and then just get cracked on the flop by some shit hands getting in behind me.
One thing I found interesting,
but let me know, because I feel there. Where was I? Because again, taking into composition.
A state of terror management, men typically
I'm under the gun plus 3. I'm middle position basically. This guy raises 2. He basically min raises.
That is one way for us to continue on our lineage
never mind. I did
live forever
symbolically
passing on our genes. We also have this idea of mortality salience, the idea of making the fact that one's death is inevitable kind of salient here. And a lot of this comes back to this idea of very, very strong existential dread, The dread of that maybe one day we won't exist anymore. And I have a friend who does research on this, and it's very interesting because some of the manipulations, are briefly describe the emotions that the thought of your death arouses or brings to you. So talk about your death and how that feels. And then specifically, this one is really intense, Jot down as specifically as you can what you think will happen when you, or happen to you as you physically die. right? And those are going to make us think very clearly about our mortality ceilings and the fact that we will die one day. And what we see with those outcomes are that people are more hostile to those against us, right? Against our kind of country, right? Promoting systems justification theory. We see more more commitment to in-groups and more hostility towards out-groups, protecting ourselves. And this all kind of comes back to this idea
the amount,
we can't always predict
of three calls
behavior from attitudes,
in a bit.
And sometimes we actually create
Hold
attitudes
on, let me
from
check
our
my other
behaviors,
tournament. Did straight arrow
and we
cash?
change them with whatever way is easiest to align with what we know to do.
How did straight arrow?
And so with that, that's all I have for today. Make sure you submit those VLQs online. I will actually put up the link this time. Beyond that, if you have any questions, stop by office hours, shoot me an email, whatever you need to do, and I will.
I would say this favors me more than it favors most people.